evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. We have a very special guest today. He's a live streamer, he's a political commentator, and he's a powerful public figure. Please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Hasan Piker.
Okay. What's up, everybody? I hope everyone's having a great time. Before I get started, I asked if they'd ever actually hosted a Twitch streamer here before, and apparently I'm the first, and judging by my performance, I'll probably be the last. I don't really know why I'm here, but or what I can contribute to the conversation in terms of the ongoing genocide in Gaza that has unfolded over the past year and a half almost, that many other more credible speakers could speak to convincingly from a point of personal involvement and a position of authority. Having said that, however, I'm going to try to do my best here. This august body has seen some of the best minds inside of its halls, and now it's hosting a Twitch streamer. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you following the footsteps of intellectual giants as nothing but a simple man. A simple man who understands right from wrong. And sometimes that's all that matters. In the words of my friend, the late great Michael Jamal Brooks, there's nothing complicated about apartheid. The morality of it is clear. If the roles were reversed and a captive Jewish population of 5 million people were being systematically starved, sieged, and dominated, everyone would understand what's going on. Its ancestral lands being destroyed, everyone would understand what's going on. So in his words, it's not a complex issue. It's super simple. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States, the most powerful country on the planet, and it acts on another population of people with total impunity, and is never held accountable for anything. Well, I guess some things are changing in that regard, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But there is no symmetry in this relationship, period. That's what Michael Jamal Brooks said. So I see no need for obfuscation, no arguments for complexity, no reasoning for preemptive genocide. Israel is an apartheid state, and its inception was a violent one, with the forced displacement of 700,000, which gave birth to a settler colonial entity that continues to dominate the lives of more than 5 million Palestinians under its illegal occupation, totaling 15 million Palestinians around the globe that are permanently displaced. Its demographic concerns, Israel's demographic concerns, are never seen in the same lens that we view nationalist and fascist projects of the past. It also happens to be one of the most impressive nationalist projects the world has ever seen, from the revitalization of Hebrew as a language to finding a nation state for a revolutionary people who had been historically oppressed, victim to countless pogroms and the Holocaust. Israel could have been a story of success and overcoming great odds, except its inception was built around a lie. That this was a land without people for a people without land. Albert Einstein called out that lie early on as well. 10 years before the inception of Israel, Einstein described the proposed creation of the state as something which conflicted with the essential nature of Judaism. He warned against the violence of Menachem Begin and many other early Zionist militias. In 1948, Einstein and a number of Jewish academics sent a letter to the New York Times to protest against a visit to America by Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin also was never able to actually come to the UK either for his involvement in previous bombing campaigns as well. In this letter, they denounced Begin's Herut, Freedom Party, likening it to a political party closely akin in its organization, in its methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. Einstein understood the dangers that nationalism of this sort presented. After all, he had fled Nazi Germany. Nowadays, This sort of analysis is met with tremendous resistance. Given our comforts living in the heart of empire, we focus more on the feelings of those in the West rather than the violence that our tax dollars are contributing to. But I want to go back to the beginning for a little bit, which helped me understand the ways in which Israel's violence has remained unchecked, especially because the similarities in the contemporary way that Israel has dished out its violence are glaringly obvious. I want to talk about the atrocities committed in Deir Yassin, the former Palestinian village a few miles west of Jerusalem. I say former because in April 1948, over 100 of its Arab residents were executed, ruthlessly slaughtered. There were graphic stories that were told of some of the survivors, including but not limited to having a baker and his son lined up against the baker's oven and trying to force the baker to throw his son in the oven. And when he refused to cooperate, throwing his son in the oven and then throwing him in afterwards. The only reason why we know is because there were survivors that were left to tell the story. So they could go and tell the other Arab villages that if the Zionist brigades were coming, that they must evacuate. The massacre was committed by Zionist forces. Radical right-wingers led the attack, but were supported by the Haganah, which later became the IDF. But Deir Yassin was not an isolated massacre. It was a pivotal moment. Deir Yassin helped convince the Arab governments to fight Israel. People fled their towns and villages, fearful that what happens at Deir Yassin might happen in their towns. 700,000 people never allowed to return to their homes. Palestinians call this the Nakba. It's also known as catastrophe. But this wasn't just the fog of war. The Nakba was, in the words of historian Ilan Pape, a master plan for the massive expulsion of Palestinians, also called Plan D or Plan Dalet. Hundreds of thousands were expelled before Israel's so-called War of Independence had ever started. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, to use Pape's words, orchestrated the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. These were not merely nationalists or settlers run amok. This was clearly defined state policy. To this very day, Israel denies having forcibly expelled Palestinians, instead claiming that they voluntarily left their homes. This myth can be considered one of the earliest and perhaps most powerful forms of Hasbara. In Hebrew, Hasbara means advocacy or explanation. In the Western world, it just means lying. In 1948, there were Jewish extremists supported by the main military raiding and depopulating Palestinian communities. In 2024, we have the same problem. In 1948, the Israeli government told the world that Palestinians were responsible for their own suffering, lying about the orphans, widows, and the homeless that Israel had created. In 2024, we have the same problem. And in 1948, when people all over the world took notice of Israel's savage treatment of Palestinians, Israel could only respond by lying, using Hasbara to tell a different kind of story about its atrocities. In 2024, we still have the same problem. Now, people always ask me, Hasan, why is Israel so important? And I think this is a rhetorical trick. Why is Israel's allegiance to America so important? I think a lot of people ask this in earnest, but some people ask because they want me to say anti-Semitic things. They think that I'm going to say, oh, because Jews are powerful, they control the media, they control the government. This is not true. That's not the reason. At this point, at different points throughout time, the story in Israel and Palestine has been more or less the same. But ultimately, Israel has served different purposes for the United States, its primary benefactor. Israel has been our Cold War ally. Israel has been a punisher of misbehaving Arab oil states. Israel has been a partner in Western espionage. It is an unsinkable aircraft carrier in a resource-rich region. That's very important to American State Department interests. But for 66 years, the violence has continued with broad support from the West. The Israeli government has been free to occupy Palestinian lands and destroy Palestinian life. Ever since the failure of the Oslo peace process in 2000, the rise of the settler movement, and Benjamin Netanyahu taking control of the Israeli government, America's ironclad support for Israel has remained exactly that. But in the last decade, something has changed. Two things have changed, as a matter of fact. The first is that Israel has totally lost the younger generation. The younger generation of Americans, but also the younger generation of the Western world in general, who are shocked by its policies in occupied Palestinian lands. And the second thing that has happened is that Israel's powerful advocates in US politics and media, the Israel lobby, no longer have a total stranglehold on the left and the right. The media is not as favorable to Israel as it once was. I'm obviously a living, breathing example of this. I think someone like myself would not exist in any other format, in any other medium, in any other time. But that's not the entire story, obviously. I'm not just here to focus on myself and what I do. I think I want to talk a little bit more about the broader picture, the bigger picture. You never could really hide a genocide from the world, but it's especially difficult in the present moment. Every day we are inundated with footage from Gaza of untold atrocities, countless atrocities. We see depictions of the worst that humanity has to offer. We see children in body bags, drone strikes, mass displacement, the horror. We see missing relatives, sick babies, wailing mothers, and so on. This accumulation of this evidence, freely available on today's internet, is what is currently burying Israel in the court of public opinion. It's turning Israel into a pariah state. Hasbara wasn't built to refute this many dead children. Israel was really bailed out in the media in the past because of how slow the establishment press was to recognize the atrocities that are unfolding. It took prestigious outlets many weeks and months to tentatively identify an obvious genocide that quickly came together in a matter of days. Nowadays, you learn about the gruesome conditions of Sde Teiman, a concentration camp, or quadcopters sniping children, or broadcasting the sound of children crying for help to lure out unsuspecting Palestinians with the express purpose of murder, months before it reaches the headlines of legacy publishers in the West. That is, if they're covered at all, like the pro-rape riots, pro-rape January 6th, that took place after the Israeli government tried to prosecute 9 concentration camp guards for, I'm sorry for using this language here, but for raping Palestinian prisoners to death on camera. I say tried because not only did the riots succeed, the main perpetrator became a television personality. And so we have learned since October 7 that Israel can conduct such wide-scale atrocities, killings, kidnappings, and bombings and expulsions, even without its usual PR shield, so long as its actual political shield in Washington holds up, as well as the Iron Dome. Now, there is a subtle but horribly corrosive effect that this has had on how people understand the world around them. At the very moment when fact-based reporting and serious journalism is most needed in this time, people are distrustful of the news. Platforms like Twitter routinely surface the worst of the worst kinds of content, but the most divisive, most hateful content. But Elon Musk is not the only person responsible for this. And I hate Elon Musk, okay? I hate Elon Musk as much as you guys hate Oxford College. I heard that if I say that, I'll get some applause breaks there. So that was my exit ramp. But it's not just Elon Musk, it's not just Twitter. It's happening all around. Young people, men in particular, who don't have much education or literacy skills with no hopeful prospects of the future are being propagandized by waves of right-wing influencers who have never had megaphones this loud. Although this issue most often gets brought up in the context of the 2024 election and Donald Trump, there's more to this. I think it's important to connect it to Palestine as well. These are forces who want to normalize the current levels of violence and to convince people that actually it's good to be this bloodthirsty. While it was Joe Biden who gave Israel the blank check with which to commit a genocide, that decision has created an entire galaxy of right-wingers who are actually in position to cash it. And cash it they are currently. If you've seen the Donald Trump cabinet picks, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The traditional forces that could keep this kind of thing in check, particularly in politics and in media, are unfortunately weak. And they're getting weaker by the moment. They're out of power. They're broke. They're technologically weak. They don't understand the space. They don't understand the online content creation sphere. And I feel like they've, most importantly, with their coverage of Gaza, discredited themselves to an entire generation. It seems right now that those people who genuinely desire for a better future, who want an alternative to the genocide, will have to start looking amongst themselves, looking within themselves, their friends, and away from the mainstream if they want to help bring something like justice into the world. So I stand before you as a man who simply wants some semblance of justice for the Palestinians. I urge you not to lean into nihilism and succumb to helplessness, because you do not need the academic pedigree to know right from wrong. All you need is your moral compass. As someone who has seen the Palestine question evolve over my past 10 years of public advocacy, I never would have imagined international organs demand legal restitution from America's most valuable asset. After all, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. Thank you. It's a little bit more somber of a tone than I take normally.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that speech. Just to run through how the rest of the evening will work, I'm going to do a moderated interview Q&A, and then after a while we're going to throw it open to questions in the audience, or I'll bring you a mic. Just to reiterate, this event is being live streamed on Twitch, so bear that in mind when you ask a question, if that's something you might not be comfortable with. Where I wanted to start, just picking up from where you ended that speech, of where we should look to, where people should look to if they want to affect change, of looking outside the mainstream. We've seen a lot of student movements here in Cambridge, over in America, of students taking direct action to try and change the policy of the government towards Palestine. How optimistic are you about the potential for change from these kind of movements?
I'm more optimistic than I've ever been, because as I kind of alluded to in the end of that speech, anyone that has been aware of the situation in Palestine for longer than, 5 years, will be the first to tell you that the attitude from the Western world is dramatically different. This doesn't mean that the governments have changed their attitude or shifted their policies, although some have. And it's unique, especially, and I stress the importance of the Western world specifically, because I think the Global South has known what a settler colonial apparatus looks like with their own personal experience with such things. But the allegiances that America needs to maintain in Europe, and even its own population, and the outlook that people have organically has shifted dramatically in the position of maybe not full-blown emancipation for Palestinians, but at least like some recognition for the atrocities. And I think that is truly unique, and it's a sign of hope despite all of the the horrifying things that we see on a daily basis.
So what does a path look like for you towards genuine change in the Israel-Palestine situation?
I think we have also completely nullified mechanisms of pressure. In the past, we at least had labor unions that even engaged in militancy at times, and we've completely neutered them in the Western world, especially in America. Our labor union participation rate is around 10%. It's actually lower than Chile, which is a country that we specifically wrote the Constitution of to institute a neoliberal project there, and they still have a higher labor union participation rate than we do. And I think that is one of the major issues. So I hope that people can focus on unionization and engaging in community activism a little bit more in this process. And I think that under the Trump administration, people will be forced to do that regardless. Participate more in politics by not directly participating in the democratic process, but organizations outside of just simply voting for the Democratic Party, for example. Political actions like that are necessary. Yeah. And that's the only way that I think this pressure valve will release.
Do you think that Western governments' reluctance to endorse rulings such as the ICC against Benjamin Netanyahu, do you see that as something fundamentally damaging, or are you already less optimistic about how much change those kinds of international institutions can have?
I mean, I think it's unique when you see the very fact that the ICC prosecutions are even taking place. It's obvious that this is a new step. These organs of international justice, the Geneva Conventions, or I guess in American terms, the Geneva Suggestions, the United Nations, like all of these international organs that are supposed to uphold humanitarian laws and principles are historically only used against the enemies of the West. And some American politicians are very open about that. I believe it was Lindsey Graham that might have had a conversation with Karim Khan in private. Karim Khan is the current ICC prosecutor that actually facilitated the arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. And in that private correspondence, I believe he told him that the ICC is not there for our allies. They're there for African warlords and thugs like Putin. And technically, throughout its inception, throughout the way that these international organs of justice have worked, that is true. That is what they've usually had in the crosshairs. So I think things are changing, and while this kind of broad sweeping change is not going to happen overnight, I do feel optimistic. And ultimately, there is, especially if there's continuous pressure from the public against the governments, that inevitably they are going to have to succumb to that pressure, or they're going to have to become more militant and maybe even more fascist in an effort to quell the naysayers, the people that are protesting against the government. We've seen a little bit of that in America in the way that our campus protests were packed up. There were prosecutions that took place, which is very unique in a country where we are supposed to be the bastion of free speech. But I think all of that resistance only causes people to grow more and more angry. And there's only so much a government can do when there's enough people that say this is inappropriate, it's done.
Yeah, you've received backlash at various points for what people perceive as excessive sympathy towards groups like the Houthis or Hezbollah, who share your opposition to Israel, but may have what many would think of as quite regressive views in other areas. Is that something you think about, worry about?
No, not necessarily. In terms of their domestic affairs, a lot of these like militant movements, these non-state actors, I am not aligned with at all. Having said that, however, that is not the reason for why they are persecuted or killed in many instances. Like Hasan Nasrallah, he's homophobic, right? Yeah, I know that. But they didn't kill him because he was homophobic. They killed him because he was a part of the axis of resistance. So I don't place a lot of emphasis on the internal dynamics and internal policies of these resistance groups, just as I don't care that America was homophobic, segregationist, and misogynistic when they aligned against the Nazi rise of power. I still rooted for the Easy Company. And every time I watch Band of Brothers, I still stand up and salute, you know, because they did what had to be done in that regard. And I can't even change the political discourse in my own theoretical democracy. So I feel like the hypothetical conversation that we're having about the civil governance of these militant groups is simply to just say, well, they're bad too. They're bad too. They deserve punishment. When in fact, the real reason I think people are critical of them is because of their opposition to Israel. I mean, I'll take it one step further. The Gulf allies that America have done a metric ton worse things than even Hezbollah has in terms of its own personal civil governance, but that's never a point of contention with our allegiance with Saudi Arabia, for example. That's unconditional. That allegiance happens because they are a very valuable asset in the region. They're a client state. We give them unlimited weapons. They sometimes use those weapons on Yemen. And that dynamic is never called into question because I don't think that honest State Department employees care about that. They care about their goals in the region.
Aside from domestic political change in the US and across the West, what do you think a permanent, stable solution looks like in the area that is currently now split between Israel and Palestine?
So this is, I have a rather controversial opinion on this, I guess, but I take note from the likes of Avi Shlaim, who have also evolved in their understanding of Israel-Palestine and have found themselves in the one-state solution camp, and I'm definitely there as well, because the settlement expansion project that happened, that coincided with the so-called peace process, made a two-sovereign state solution virtually impossible. Either you have to forcibly expel 750,000 settlers from both occupied East Jerusalem and occupied West Bank, which is not only impossible, but would be very violent, or you recognize that the current order of business is that Israel is the singular sovereign state, but it's an apartheid state. And that's the way I approach it. I believe that Israel must dissolve its apartheid and offer citizenship to every single Palestinian, equal rights, equal representation, and become a secular democracy. Israel cannot maintain its demographic concerns. Because what are demographic concerns at the end of the day? I mean, we have demographic concerns in America, but we know exactly what that means when a white supremacist says we have demographic concerns in America. But that calculation is so different when it comes to Israel. Israel's demographic concerns are not seen in the same lens of ethnic and religious superiority implemented by one group and completely dominating and subjugating the outsiders in a similar vein as Nazi Germany or even apartheid South Africa did. It's seen as a mechanism of defense. We have security concerns. We have to have a demographic majority. I can't think of another state that is in the comfortable bosom of Western empire that openly states in its laws that they have to populate certain areas with a certain percentage of Jewish people, or any number of any kind of ethnic group. It doesn't have to just be Jewish people, but that is the reality for Israel. So I think that is that's old school politics, and I think it has no place in the modern world.
Just to touch on something else you brought up in your speech, social media. Do you think that is something that has fundamentally change politics, sort of the democratization of information, or do you think that it's the same dynamics playing out over a new medium?
I think it's fundamentally changed politics, sometimes for the good and oftentimes for really awful purposes. I obviously benefit greatly from it. Someone like myself would never be considered a media figure, especially with how isolated mainstream publications are. I feel like I do not fit in the boundaries of permissible speech in mainstream politics and mainstream political discourse. There's a lot more space on the right for that sort of thing, but there's rarely ever any space for the left in this conversation. So yeah, I greatly benefit from the democratization of media. I also understand that for the first time ever, we get to see conflict in real life as it's happening, as it's unfolding. We get to automatically see the victims of American empire or the victims of Israeli actions as real human beings. In the past, I think, and in the early stages, in the immediate aftermath of October 7, CNN and numerous other publications basically kept running the same route. They immediately had a IDF officer that is tasked with basically propagandizing and contextualizing whichever new fresh hell Israel had unfolded upon the Palestinian population. They would go on CNN and immediately talk about how these are terror babies. They had to be killed. This hospital is a terror headquarters. We had to bomb it. And because of TikTok and because of other various social media platforms, people were able to see that that was not the case. People were able to see that, no, you're killing, regular civilians. Like, I know because, I watch them on TikTok. And I think that has definitely played a role in people no longer being as confident in legacy publishers. But there's also the downsides of the democratization of media, whereas people with whichever mindset can go on and do something that we like to call grifting, where you saw a lot of this during COVID, where people were just straight up saying, mainstream narratives on COVID are all false. COVID is fake. It's not real. The vaccines make you gay and autistic. Don't take the vaccine. And there was plenty of space for that. Like, some people were actually selling their own personal products and trying to monetize on this. But other people were simply doing it because there was a lot of interest in this. There was a market for fake information. And I don't know how to deal with that. I guess spirited debate is one method, but when the faucet is so when the faucet is open and it's uncontrollable, when there's so much disinformation, I truly don't know how you deal with that.
How do you see your role within that new space? Is it more of an activist, more of a journalist, an entertainer, or some kind of mixture of the three?
I would say a mix of the three. I don't call myself a journalist. I'm a political commentator, but first and foremost, my goal is to be educational, but also be approachable and appealing and entertaining. So I try to make things, I try to make certain subjects that are otherwise complex easier to understand and also entertaining. That's the value I think I provide, and urge people to take action as well, whether it be going to a campus protest, or whether it be unionizing their workplaces, or whether it be joining a local organization. And many members of my community have gone out and done just that. Some have actually gone into local office as well. But outside of that, I also try to combat the misinformation as well, because there's a lot of that out there. I try to hold people's hands through the process of looking at the news. I look at it with a critical lens, and I try to explain to people the biases that certain outlets might have in favor of a particular direction. Omitting key details, burying the lead. Something that a lot of people, I think, are now familiar with is passive voice. This is something that Americans, at least, are very knowledgeable on. Whenever there's any instance of police brutality, the media always makes it seem as though this chaos unfolded on its own. I think mainstream press has utilized the passive voice for all actions that Israel is engaged in as well, quite a bit. You know, bullets enter the leg of Palestinian. Like, who shot the Palestinian person? Like, how do we get here? You know? I try to explain to people why there are some editorial controls in this regard. But ultimately, I rely heavily on mainstream reporting. I have wonderful friends in these institutions, these outlets that do a tremendous job, and I still greatly value objective news reporting. I wouldn't be able to do what I do without it.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting what you say about the passive voice. We actually had the head of the BBC here a few weeks ago and asked him about that, and it's obviously something they think about, but it's obviously up to you how you interpret where that comes from. You did an interview actually on CNN recently where the concept of you being the left's Joe Rogan was brought up, which is something you're quite dismissive of.
Yeah.
Because you think...
Because I'm not bald. That's what it is.
That's the only difference, of course. You think it's more about policy. It's not about the left finding a Joe Rogan figure. It's about the Democratic Party changing its policies.
Yeah.
Do you think is that the right kind of analysis we should take when looking at Donald Trump's election victory, as opposed to policy over sort of the more ephemeral stuff, the media communication?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think Donald Trump represents a shift in attitude towards these institutions that people are obviously very upset about. And one of the major gaps in communication for the Democratic Party was their position as the defenders of American institutions. And it's very obvious, and this is maybe a little bit scary to contend with, but Americans don't care about these institutions. They don't give a shit. They just want the price of eggs to go down. They want housing to be more affordable. And if one side is at least looking at the anger and frustration that people have and saying, you're angry and you're valid to be angry, and you're angry because of marginalized people, you're angry because of the establishment, you're angry because undocumented migrants have actually taken your social safety nets, and the other side is simply saying, no, you shouldn't be angry, things are good. It's a vibe session. The economy is actually not that bad. Shut up. You had marginal improvements in your life. Why are you complaining? Then yeah, people are going to be like, I'm angry, and that guy at least recognizes that anger. And I think that's what Trump did very well. It wasn't because he's like, he's a policy wonk or anything. Of course not. But at the very least, there was a recognition of the frustration that people had. And then he was able to channel that anger and frustration at appropriate targets that, especially in a country like America, have always been under attack regardless. And that's what's very frustrating about this process, because Democrats should technically have the right solutions to these issues. But if they also are zealots in terms of advancing this neoliberal project, this third-way neoliberal attitude unconditionally, yeah, they're going to end up losing over and over again to increasingly more right-wing charlatans like Donald Trump.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of commentators around the Democratic Party and sort of observers here in the UK who would question that characterization of the Biden presidency in particular as unmitigated neoliberalism. They would point to, the Build Back Better Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure spending, the student loan stuff. They would argue, there's an argument that exists that Biden did all that and he still lost, so why does it matter? Why do you think that's wrong?
I think that's wrong because this is something that I saw on Twitter that is just like has burned into my consciousness at this point. But if you see a homeless person and you chuck 2 pennies at them, technically their material wealth improved by 2 cents. They had 0, now they have 2 cents. But the homeless person yells back at you, says, fuck you, throws the pennies back. Why is the homeless person angry at me? I actually improved his material wealth by a dramatic percentage. I don't understand. Why is the homeless person so angry at me now? That is the that is the way that the Democratic Party operates. When I say we need broad left-wing populism, I'm not talking about like a technocratic approach that will maybe unfold a decade later. I'm talking about real, genuine, immediate change. Like Kamala Harris talked about building 3 million housing units. Now, there's a way to do that I think is good, and there's a way to communicate that I think is good, and then there's the way that Kamala Harris communicated it. She said, this is the opportunity economy. She said, we're going to build 3 million housing units with a public-private partnership. This kind of language is just simply undesirable for people outside of the halls of academia, or people who are really invested in YIMBY urbanist Twitter. That's just the unfortunate reality of it. I think she should have come out and been like, we're going to build houses, we're going to do a federal jobs program, we're going to get everybody to work, and we're going to build public housing. We need to claw back the housing market from the hands of everyone that considers homes to be a speculative asset. This is not Wall Street. Every American needs a home, every American needs shelter, and we're going to give that to you. That is left-wing populism. The technocratic approach that the Democratic Party follows is not left-wing populism. It's just, again, private-public partnership, tax cuts, deregulation. She even talked about deregulating housing. Now that might mean zoning deregulation, or that might mean deregulation that makes houses even shittier than they are in America, and they are pretty shitty. So that's what I mean. If you're going to lie, if you're a politician, and you're not going to implement any of your actual policies, then why not lie about broad, sweeping legislative changes? Why simply lie about the most boring, technocratic, nerdy ways in which you will not actually implement any sort of reasonable changes that will immediately improve people's lives? So while Biden did a lot with the NLRB, for example, and this is something that I've actually talked about quite a bit, there was an issue with communicating that, in my opinion. They failed on that front. Republicans campaign every 4 years, or Republicans campaign every single day for 4 years straight. Democrats only campaign once every 4 years or once every 2 years when they remember there's an election. And so on that front, they didn't even do a good enough job of like communicating what these changes were that they had implemented. They constantly got held up in their own internal strife with the likes of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema that actually undermined some of these bills. They were too procedurally invested in the Senate parliamentarian. There was supposed to be a bill that was going to pass with a simple majority that would have tacked on a federally mandated increase in $15 minimum wage. The Senate parliamentarian said no, and the Democrats went, what are you going to do? It's the Senate parliamentarian. She said no. Okay, fire her, and then hire a new Senate parliamentarian. That's precisely what the Republicans had done under Dick Cheney, under the George W. Bush administration. There is no reason to hold up these procedures, and there's no reason to claim that you are the institutional norm defenders, when in fact you have no respect for these institutions at the end of the day anyway, and you know for a fact that the Republicans are always going to violate those norms and violate these institutions in an effort to get whatever their agenda is across. And Democrats don't do that. They don't fight. And I think that people have lost confidence in them as well because of this. And they have a long way to go, I think, to reinstate, to recreate that trust in them.
Thank you. As we are here in the UK, I thought I'd ask a question about British politics.
I love that.
You haven't done the voice so far during the main talk, which I think is we're all grateful for, but there's still time.
I'm trying. I'm holding on.
What do you think are the main conclusions that should be drawn from the general election this July and the subsequent first few months of the Starmer government?
Oof. I said this originally. Obviously, Keir Starmer, also known as Keir Stalin, he was slated to win. The Tories had the incumbency disadvantage that everyone experienced all around the globe, pretty much, with the exception of Mexico. And he was going to win regardless. But I was very worried And I think my predictions are coming true already that his approach to fixing all of the problems that England and the UK is experiencing was not enough. There was another side of this conversation that didn't get as much coverage, I think, even in America, the Reform Party's movement and how successful they were. I think that's terrifying. And now it seems Nigel Farage is a more popular figure than Keir Starmer already. And I said at the time that if Keir Starmer does not, immediately work to fund the NHS and really hire a lot more people and fix public transit and try to fix the housing market in the UK, the Reform Party is going to come in inevitably and sweep. And I'm afraid that is the direction that you guys are heading in. Not dissimilar to what we're experiencing in America.
Okay, my final question before we throw it open to the audience, a simple one. Do you think the world will be a brighter or a darker place in 10 years' time?
Oof. I want to hope that it's a brighter place, but all trends point to the exact opposite of that, it seems. I feel like we're experiencing a lot of chaos all around the globe. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Now they're talking about potentially North Korean troops that might be deployed. Obviously, Israel is pummeling Gaza and is slated to permanently annex North Gaza. They're still bombing Lebanon as well. There's a lot of back and forth happening there, despite the fact that there was supposed to be a ceasefire with specific carve-outs that allow Israel to continue bombing Lebanon and killing Lebanese people. You have, I guess, the incel president of South Korea that decided to do the shittiest martial law coup of all time, who backed away because quorum was established. That was really funny. But there's a lot of chaos and a lot of instability, and I think more importantly than all of that, there is, especially in the Western world, these liberal democracies that have gone unchecked with no even ostensibly socialist or communist counter power, any other pole that maybe moves people in the opposite direction, have had unlimited neoliberalism for the past 3 decades, and I think we're seeing the impact of that now and what that has done to the economies individually, and that's done to the public as a whole. I think that a lot of people do not have a lot of optimism for the future, especially our generation and younger, and the economic anxieties that they experience, if left unaddressed, if left unexamined, is going to continue building the otherwise nascent fascist movements that we've seen in many Western European nations and even Eastern European countries as well. You have the AfD in Germany, you have the Reform movement here, you have Marine Le Pen's party in France, Meloni is already in power in Italy, and it's happening globally. You have Donald Trump in America. These guys are all ideologically aligned on the boundaries of nationalism. And I'm very fearful about the prospect of the future, especially when there's no mechanism of pushback. And in all of that instability, I think, at least historically speaking, fascism has always been a means to reinstate control, to institute some stability and control. And that's a terrifying prospect for the future. Not to be too much of a downer, sorry.
Thank you. Okay, so now it's time for some questions from the audience. If you just stick your hand up and then wait till we get a mic over to you, then you can ask your question. We'll go just here. Yep, let's stand up.
Hi, I'm Sadiq. I go to Downing College. I've been a fan for a number of years. I just wanted to ask, what's your view on the Global South's prospects going forwards? Because obviously we hear news about their consolidation by the West. What should we be optimistic about when looking at the Global South?
I think, all things considered, the prospects of the Global South is definitely trending in a more positive direction than the rest of the world. And I think that has somewhat to do with Chinese initiatives as well. They're offering more favorable loans. They're engaging in development because they're interested in creating a secondary market, because everyone understands that like the next stage of the Cold War is most likely going to be the United States of America against China. And if the tariff faucet opens up, all of a sudden you need other developed markets to be able to sell products to. So in that process, I think a lot of people are, I guess, hedging their bets. They're leveraging against American dominance. And this has been somewhat prosperous for the global South, but I don't necessarily know where it goes in the next 10 to 20 years. But it's not that bad, all things considered.
Should we go on the front row here?
Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your moral force of your arguments, and I think most of us can agree that the people who perpetrated these crimes in Gaza should face the full force of justice. But I do struggle to see in your arguments actual moral consistency or constancy. How you just talked about the Houthis, for example, I'm sure it's disturbing, not only for me as a gay man, but for other gay men, when you dismiss things like the murder of tens of people at the hands of the Houthis as a mere internal issue. It strikes me that that doesn't seem very morally consistent. And likewise, I think some of your remarks on Gaza have been troubling for many women. As you know, in the October 7th massacre, the Hamas forces who entered not only murdered hundreds of teenagers our age, but also, according to the United Nations, committed a pattern of sexual violence, targeting many of the most vulnerable women, including people who were taken hostage. It strikes me to win this argument and to actually provide justice to the causes you seek about, you need to be morally consistent. And you need to understand that there's a universality in our values, where we must think about women and think about gay people, no matter where they are. And I'm wondering, have you always been the most helpful advocate for your causes?
Great question. So, in terms of the sexual violence, I've never denied it, and that there are definitely people that have clipped things out of context to make it seem as though I have. But my approach on this has always been consistent, whether it be the Ansar Allah administration and the violent actions that they take against the gay Yemeni population, or whether it be any sort of sexual violence that anyone has been victim to. I think that is completely unacceptable. There is no world in which that I would say that the perpetrators of such crimes should not face any justice whatsoever. I think that I simply look at historical reference points such as like the Nat Turner Rebellion, for example, or the Haitian Revolution, or even the many acts that the ANC's militant wing engaged in the struggle to abolish the apartheid in South Africa. And I recognize that when the dust is settled, those historic wrongs must be accounted for. But the much larger problem here is still always going to be the maintenance of the apartheid. So it's not necessarily that I dismiss these acts. It might come across as dismissive, but the reason as to why I cover it in the way that I do is because I understand that there is still a much greater problem, and I consider many of the ways in which people bring this up to be, I wouldn't say whataboutism, but to serve the purpose of deflecting the attention away from Israel's actions. Does that make sense?
Shall we go right there in the third row? Yeah, you. Yeah. It's up to you.
Hi, I was struggling whether or not to ask this question, but potentially following on from what was just asked. I do appreciate the work that you do for the left. I don't want to diminish the extent to which you advocate for people's, general rights to exist, especially women. However, I think maybe the person is political here. So you have been embroiled in controversy on account of your use of sex workers in your personal life, which you do openly speak on.
Yeah.
I support making the safety and autonomy of sex workers a priority. I don't oppose the criminalisation of women who take part in this kind of labour. But I equally think that if we are to accept The premise is that all work is ultimately coercive and that sex work is work, which I think we both do agree on that. Then what is the word that we use in society for coerced sex, right? Secondly, do you accept that hedging your bets that sex workers you see are wholly consenting is perhaps naive, especially insofar as like a plumber fixing your bathroom who's in a tricky situation is incomparable in terms of the degree of suffering undertaken, like in terms of a woman engaging in sex work, for example, due to her limited options.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely correct in terms of the extra coercion that might take place, and in many instances, it is a very real problem. But I think that my approach to this has always been, first of all, I've dated sex workers as well. I'm very public and very open about my advocacy for sex work. In terms of the moral dynamic of it, yes, I understand that there is a difference there as long as people are voluntarily, as adults, consenting to the act. And the only way, I think, to ensure that that is the case is to not only destigmatize sex work in general, but also make sure that there are proper mechanisms in place to ensure that this is a safe process, that people are not engaging in this act involuntarily. So I understand your concerns. This is something that I've talked about with many sex workers, both on my stream and outside of that, and they seem to think that the best possible pathway forward is through decriminalization and destigmatization, and that the ways in which we currently currently analyze sex work is only unhelpful because it makes it virtually impossible to seek out help and to ensure that these criminal elements that are truly atrocious are prosecuted with and dealt with.
Should we go right in the back corner over there?
Trinity College is the largest and by far the richest college at Cambridge. It built over £2 billion worth of wealth through all the nefarious means you'd probably expect, including continued investment in arms companies like Elbit Systems. After student pressure and protests last year, the college pledged to divest. In October, the college broke that promise, backtracking, the master saying that they regretted creating hardship funds for students affected by conflict. My question, given this, is, as a student at that college who has been involved in organising direct action, I have been staggered by the apathy of my peers. How can students encourage other students to use their voices to pressurise the institutions in which they exist? And how can students stave off demoralisation when shouting at ears that seem not to be listening?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I think that you have to see the successes that you have gained through direct participation and direct action, such as the college encampments, and keep the pressure as best as you can, and continue the struggle, because at the end of the day, there's only so much pressure that these institutions can withstand. If there is more and more protests and more disorder, civil disobedience, campuses are inevitably going to have to buckle. And there are many different examples of success in this regard. There is a lot of academic divestment that is occurring already. But I'm sorry to hear that Trinity College went back on their promise and is continuing to, I guess, fund Elbit Systems. It's a truly heinous company.
Shall we go right on the back row there? Let's see.
Hi, thank you. You've kind of previously made comments about streets soaked red in the capitalist flood of landlords. In an era of really endemic political violence where Britain has seen 2 MPs killed in the last 2 years, do you think that's kind of a constructive way of bringing a left-wing position or kind of criticising capitalism and the role of landlords into this discourse, or is it sort of something you can say from behind a camera that actually has real consequences but doesn't actually make kind of the impact that you'd hope to make?
I was talking to a landlord when I had that conversation, and I don't think that he had an issue with it. He knew that we were messing around. But given that this is what now 6-year-old conversation that I had with a landlord friend of mine at the time, yeah, I wouldn't take that too seriously. But thank you. No, I am not an advocate for killing landlords.
Shall we go right there? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your speech. It seems over the past 5 years, the left has spent a lot of time building up defenses against hate speech, which in the past year and a half, have been really turned against us on college campuses. In England, the child of Holocaust survivors was arrested for terrorist speech. Why does it seem that only the right fights for free speech? Why does the left not fight for free speech? And should the left fight for free speech?
So that's an interesting question, because I think that historically the left has fought for free speech, and this still has limitations. I guess if you're talking about free speech in the American understanding, because that's the most expansive, we have never really abided by the principles of free speech to begin with. It seemingly only encompasses protecting hate speech, and rarely ever speech that is truly disruptive to the pre-existing hierarchies. And what I mean by that is, and this has happened in the UK as well historically, where fascists, when they protest in the streets, they get police protection. But when you know, and there's any sort of socialist uprising or leftist uprising, they're usually the ones who have to face police brutality and police violence, at least historically. America, like I said, has the most expansive free speech protections, and yet in 32, if I'm not mistaken, it might be 36 now, states in the United States of America, you actually have to sign a pledge if you want to become a school teacher in the state of Texas, for example. You have to sign a pledge that says you will never engage in BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions on the state of Israel, which is, once again, a formerly successful initiative against apartheid South Africa. That's where BDS comes from originally. And yet we have these very obvious restrictions on free speech when it comes to Israel. I think that ultimately the notion that there is free speech absolutism is somewhat silly. It's never really existed. And I think that there are well-established boundaries that many people agree to across the board. Like, there are certain kinds of freedom of expression that obviously should be considered criminal. Child pornography, for example. Like, that's not protected under free speech. And some places are more expansive, others are not. But ultimately, I think it doesn't really matter. There's no real champions of free speech absolutism. That doesn't exist. I guess maybe, like, with the exception of Noam Chomsky, I've rarely ever heard anyone make a convincing free speech absolutist argument that is genuine. It's just not something that the right believes in. That's why they have been able to portray themselves as champions of free speech in an effort to get away with hate speech without any consequence whatsoever, because free speech doesn't mean that there should be any sort of freedom from consequences. And yet they have positioned themselves as champions of free speech while simultaneously, in the United States of America at least, right-wing groups are responsible for book bannings, books being pulled out of libraries all across the country. They very successfully launched an initiative against what they consider to be CRT, critical race theory, woke DEI policies and the like, and they have truly undermined free speech and free expression, and also just like a normal education about American history. And they've been doing this very successfully while simultaneously pointing the finger of blame at the left. So I think ultimately we just have to be reasonable about it and understand that there are very real limitations to such things. And when people cynically try to regulate free speech with honest parties that are involved in spirited debate, then you can shout them down a little bit. You can tell them, no, that's not the case. I think one very clear example of this is the conversation surrounding Israel-Palestine. In America, we censured Rashida Tlaib. She's a Palestinian congressperson. We censured her in our Congress because she said, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." This is an emancipatory slogan that I think people cynically claimed was anti-Semitic and censured her. No such censures exists for the likes of Tom Cotton, who very famously wrote a New York Times article demanding that Black Lives Matter protests be violently squashed by the military. Tom Cotton, who has demanded that pro-Palestinian protesters and environmental activists be killed for protesting and blocking roads. There is a Louisiana Senator Kennedy, who in a congressional hearing about anti-Semitism, hate speech, and Islamophobia, turned to an Arab speaker and said, that she was in support of Hamas, Hezbollah, and that she should put her head in a bag in shame. No censures existed there. So no one is really principled on this, and I think it's important to point out those inconsistencies and just say, look, in order for there to be a productive conversation, there's going to be some boundaries. And if there are no boundaries, then you're not going to be able to have a productive conversation. So that's what I think at the end of the day. I don't know. It's not a very great example. It's not a very great way to end that point, but it's not something that I have any sort of like well-defined perspective on. It's a case-by-case basis. I'll know it when I see it.
Let's go just there. Yeah, in the green.
Hi. Considering the success of right-wing initiatives across the West, how do you think these will impact the way in which left-wing speakers conduct themselves? And do you think we will see left-wing politicians engage in maybe more centrist policies, or perhaps engage in the type of rhetoric we see from the worst of their right-wing counterparts?
I hope that they don't do that, but all signs point to that right now. I mean, Seth Moulton came out and immediately after the election defeat was like, oh, we lost because the Democratic Party was too pro-trans. It's not, that was never even a conversation. There was no trans speaker at the DNC. The Democrats didn't even aesthetically point to any marginalized communities and said, we're going to defend you guys. They didn't even do that. They went super right-wing. And it seems like they are more comfortable capitulating to right-wing framing on issues like we saw with the conversation surrounding undocumented migrants and what to do. America is a nation of immigrants. The reason why we have not fallen in the trap that many developed countries have in terms of their population growth stunting is because of the unrestricted immigration into the country that has kept the nation young. And yet, the Democratic Party this time around did something that I truly consider to be unconscionable, where they caved on the right-wing framing on this issue and basically admitted that undocumented immigrants constitute a national security threat. So if they go in that direction, they're just going to keep losing as the right continues to increase the stakes. Because there's no world in which you can outflank the Republican Party on hate, on bigotry. That's their territory. That's the comfortable space that they exist in. So they're just going to keep upping the ante, the right is, as the Democrats try to catch up and make a fool of themselves. And even if they were to be able to successfully, capture the attention of white nativists who want this kind of anti-immigrant agenda, do we really want that, is the question that Democrats should ask themselves.
Let's go right over there in the third row, in the pink.
Hi guys, I just wanted to ask, since you're known for blending humour with serious political discussion, in your opinion, what is the role of comedy and satire in shaping political views? How do you prevent this from possibly undermining the gravity of the issues you're trying to address?
I feel like there's a time and space for it, right? I'll crack a couple jokes here and there, but obviously if I'm going to be talking about some like very serious things that are happening, you know, I try to limit the ways in which I quip. But I think comedy is a very important tool in helping people understand the world. Good comedy, specifically comedy that punches up, exposes the idiocy of you know, normal existence, and has the capacity to undermine pre-existing social hierarchies that we take for granted. So I value it quite a bit. But you know, there's a time and place for it. I think that there are certain things that I guess the higher the stakes get, the trickier it gets to be able to truly find humor in otherwise very humorless situations. And a good comedian can take that and find humor in it, whereas many who don't actually end up, I think, coming across as though they're reactionary. This is a problem that happens a lot. Comedians test their bits. If they want to be edgy and they fail and they bomb, they come across like they genuinely believe these things. These are firmly held opinions. That's what it comes across as. And it's, I try to be as unrestrictive as possible and as understanding and as charitable as possible to people who are trying to make other people laugh. But having said that, I think it's both a very important tool and maybe sometimes something that has no place in certain subject matter. At least I'm not well equipped enough to be able to make jokes about certain things.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions before the end. We'll go there in the yeah, you in the college puffer. Yeah.
Hello. I'd like to ask you about your inconsistency when it comes to Russia and Ukraine compared to your takes on Israel-Palestine. You talk a lot about the status of the Palestinians, which I agree is a horrible act, but when considering Russian annexation of Ukraine, you quote say, "It boggles my mind that Crimea belongs to Ukraine." And when you talked about Crimea's ownership of Crimea, you said Ukraine was like, you just stick to that to Mongolia, I think.
No, I said Crimea belongs primarily to the Tatar population,
Yeah,
which is historically.
Greece, Russia. And
I said Greece. I said Turkey and Greece. That was a joke. I don't think, for the record, I don't think Crimea belongs to Turkey. Just so you understand. Maybe you didn't get it, but I don't think that that's valid.
And the other question.
Go ahead.
This is in addition to this, but when asked for your opinion on the ceasefire, you mentioned Boris Johnson as the reason for why it failed, even though Boris Johnson's arrival that was on the 9th of April, and then Lavrov mentioned his arrival to Kyiv was on the 9th of April, and Lavrov himself said on the 7th of April, way before that happened, the Ukrainian demands are unacceptable, a ceasefire and a peace deal will not happen. So the question is, why do you flirt so much with Russian narratives when it comes to Russia and Ukraine?
So in terms of Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territory, I think it's wholly unjustifiable and inhumane and very cruel. I've made that very clear time and time again. As far as the ceasefire negotiation, I believe you're talking about the 15-point plan that was discussed in Antalya, if I'm not mistaken, at a time when Ukraine had maximum leverage in comparison to where it is now. And there is no inconsistency in that narrative, especially because I was a champion of a ceasefire for Ukraine very early on. Just as I am a champion for ceasefire in Israel-Palestine as well, because first and foremost, I think what we have to do is stop the bleeding. And I thought that the Ukrainian leverage at the time was much better, and I actually celebrated Zelensky for engaging in this conversation in a very meaningful way, where even trickier demands that he could have made that would have been tricky for the Ukrainian population to accept, he was conciliatory on, where he wanted to push the Crimea question back to a referendum 15 years in the future. And I think that that was a very solid way to potentially try and stop the Russian onslaught. Now, make no mistake, I don't believe that Russia was going to be committed to the ceasefire negotiation either. That much I made clear as well. But the point I always stressed was ultimately every conflict ends with treaties. And that the quicker you can arrive at that position when you have the most amount of leverage, the better it will be to save the lives of countless people in Ukraine. And I believe, unfortunately, that is what has happened. In terms of Russian posturing on the ceasefire process, you mentioned Lavrov. Yeah, they have the same political pressures, maybe not to the same degree as Zelensky does, but they have the same political pressures. They have to posture, they have to make themselves look strong. I think ultimately what matters is what you leave on the table and what you come to terms with. And one thing that I stressed over and over again for people who kept saying, this is appeasement, at the time, this was years ago at this point, was that if the ceasefire process falls apart, and if Russia continues to bomb Ukraine, then you're still back to square one. So nothing technically changes with the exception of a period of stability. So I am always going to be in favor of trying to maintain any sort of treaty or any sort of ceasefire in general. Same with Lebanon and same with Gaza. So I don't think it's inconsistent at all.
Okay, and we will take one final question. Let's go right all the way at the back in the corner over there.
Thank you. You claim to be anti-establishment and say we need left-wing populism. So why have you not only criticized but colluded with the establishment on several occasions to denigrate existing left-wing populist movements, George Galloway and the Workers' Party, and Jackson Hinkle, HasanAbi and the American Communist Party, which is new?
Did you say I've denigrated George Galloway? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
I don't think I did, but
Well, you denigrated the actually makes sense.
I don't think I've done that, but as far as the American Communist Party, more power to them. If they're able to successfully mobilize, then that's great. Do I trust Jackson Hinkle, former HasanAbi head, to not be a federal agent and be genuinely invested in the uplifting of the working class all around the globe? Time will tell. I think if someone is going to occupied Ukrainian territory and then posturing alongside the Russian forces and then freely traveling back to the United States, I'm gonna look at that guy and go, maybe you're a Fed.
Okay, that's not.
I'm just saying, that's my red line. Usually, there's a lot of infiltrators. There's a lot of infiltrators that historically have tried to undermine any kind of leftist mobilization, and I think that's a pretty valid red line for me, at least. Like it goes beyond reasonable disagreement when you're, when you are positioning yourself as someone who is going to be against America at every step of the way. Many people that have come before you in this great deliberative body have criticized me for even misunderstanding my positions and saying that I am a unconditional anti-American commentator. But I think I'm a little bit more reasonable than that. For me, if you go to occupied Ukrainian territory to do propaganda for the Russian government, which is not a socialist government at all, and it's a autocrat-backed plutocracy that is engaging in completely unjustifiable actions and engaging in slaughter of people. I think that's, and then you were freely able to travel back to the United States. I'm gonna be like, oh, this might be a Fed.
Okay, we're gonna have one more. We're gonna squeeze one more extra in after that one. Let's go right here. Yeah. So, well.
Talking about all these different issues, I want to head to another issue which I find particularly interesting. You're widely considered a champion socialist of the four aisles. And I saw that you were traveling here on first class when you came to the UK. Personally, I never went on first class. I hope you had a comfortable travel. I still think it's an issue worth pointing out, because when it comes to especially the consumption of luxury goods, sports cars, $1 million property, which you've been known to engage in, how can you justify yourself as a moral character on the left when you are benefiting more than many capitalists are from what you're doing as being a Twitch streamer, exploiting other streamers through your reaction content, which you are, which is a widely established fact. They're socially necessary every time, considering what you got. You put in that much effort as the other streamers that you engage do reacting to. And furthermore, when it comes to...
Can we keep it brief if we can?
When it comes to the consumption of luxury goods, what do you think Marx, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Hitler, what do you think they would say about this kind of new brand of socialism that you represent? Which is, by any measure of it...
I think we're asking the same question here.
I think that you are...
We're on for a very short for time, please.
To real societal revolution change, because you are no more than a racketeer.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I don't know how familiar you are with Karl Marx, but his bestie literally had a factory, so I don't think that he had that much issue with people that came from means. But having said that, however, I do think that it's a good point. What you rise is the point that you brought up, that socialism is about being in a poverty cult or living an ascetic lifestyle, is, I think, pure reactionary garbage. The entire purpose of socialist movements is to allow people to have their own individual freedoms, to have autonomy in their lives, to be able to have some semblance of workplace democracy so they can experience these freedoms and feel like a fucking human being. And that is what I practice, and that is what I preach as well. I have a cooperative in the way that I have my own podcast is Equal Say, Equal Pay. My producer, March, is sitting right there. Makes a lot more money than the average Twitch streamer does, as a matter of fact, for that reason. And I'm a truly fortunate person. I'm truly fortunate for being able to find such success in this field. As far as the accusations of exploitation outside of participating in capitalism, which is impossible to avoid unless you go and, I guess, live in the woods and make your own axe and cut the trees down and build a home for yourself that way. It's impossible to avoid capitalism. That's why most socialists will say that there's no ethical consumption. As far as like my glamorous lifestyle goes, these are voluntary subscriptions that people choose to sign on for. I've told people time and time again that they do not have to subscribe to me, but if they want to, they can. Back in the day, it was to avoid the top of the hour ad break. I don't even serve ads anymore. I do a decent amount of fundraising on top of that, even though I don't think that philanthropy is socialism. I don't think that it works that way. And I work with labor movements in general. I'd say that someone of my level of wealth or my level of means is perfectly valid and perfectly appropriate. You might consider that to be self-serving, but I don't. And it's never been something that is inconsistent. When I was broke, I advocated for the same exact things that I advocate for now, and people would say, you're just jealous of the wealthy. Now that I do have money, people say you're a hypocrite. And I don't know what the expectation is from for someone like myself to just like cast aside. Once I got a little bit of money, this socialism shit is over. You want me to become like a right-wing Ben Shapiro type of person? Like, you want me to cast aside my values and my principles? No, I'm not going to do that. So I'm very fortunate, and I try to use all of that fortune for good and to continue uplifting voices that are unheard and to continue to advocate for people to get that same level of emancipation and autonomy in their workplaces and across the board. It's no different than my advocacy for against police brutality. I'm not black. but I speak on black issues. I'm not trans, but I speak against transphobia. It's I am not any longer broke, but it doesn't change that dynamic for me even a little bit. I think that I'm still going to continue doing that, regardless of the home that I purchased for myself. It's not my fault that the California housing market is dog shit. I purchased a house for myself that my family can live in. That's a pretty valid thing. That's a pretty normal thing. I think that's something that everyone should be able to do, should be able to get. Now, if I were to say, well, I own a home now, so I think the housing market is good. We shouldn't do any public housing. We shouldn't claw back housing prices. Then yeah, that would be inconsistent. That would be hypocritical. I guess it would be more consistent in the way that you interpret who I am and what I should be, what values I should be presenting. But I think that would be true hypocrisy. And as far as the luxury car goes, I leased a dentist car, an EV, just so everybody knows. I'm going back to a Toyota, don't worry. So I can get my socialist bona fides.
Okay.
But yeah.
Thank you. That is sadly all we've got time for. I'm going to say a couple of other things in a second, but first of all, let's all say a warm thank you to Hasan. So for those of you in the room, tomorrow we will have our final debate of term on the motion, this House believes the West is hypocritical towards China. For those of you watching online, we are the Cambridge Union. Find us on Instagram and YouTube for so much more. It's great. For those of you who have signed up for the meet and greet, that will be upstairs in the library. You will have got an email. There is only people who've got the email can come in, so please don't come along unless you have received that. There was a ballot on our story. So if you just remain seated whilst me and Hasan leave the chamber, and if you are in the meet and greet, then come upstairs. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me, guys.
I will join you shortly, yeah?
Okay.
Yeah.
Should I take this mic off?
We can do it upstairs, that's all good.
Okay.
So if you want to, we can just go back to the room before, take a minute whilst they set up everything for the meet and greet, and then...
How'd that go? Is that good?
I thought it was really good.
Expected?
Yeah, I mean, there was lots of challenging questions, as I suppose we could have...
Oh no, that's nowhere
fun.
near as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Oh yeah.
Bro, the fizz in this room go incredibly hard. Yeah, it's just like how British people
say hi.
dress. This is how it is.
It's free form.
Call that in the Cambridge halls?
What?
Will March call that in the Cambridge halls?
Yeah. Yeah. Get your money up, March.
Yeah.
What's up?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.